We'll now look into countermeasures and research carried out to counter the problems and their consequences discussed in the previous part.
We'll try to look very briefly at some prophylactic measures that we can be taking. I'll tell you something about research that is being carried out. I will tell you a little bit about some simulations where we locked people up, and a little bit about the Concordia Arctic Station where we are trying to do some, ESA is trying to do some research. I say we, I'm no longer really working full-time at ESA, but I'm a consultant there. Essentially, prophylactic measures include selecting the right people, putting the right people together, giving them certain general training, both as individuals in teamwork, leadership, conflict handling, making sure that they're a compatible team, and building the team. These are things that one can do. So one can take some action to try to make sure the situation doesn't get too bad. Actually, a lot of these things one can do also here on the ground. One can do a lot of leadership training and group dynamics and sensitivity and communications here with doctors, nurses working together. We have tried it out in hospitals. The nurses were quite willing to take part in such training. Doctors weren't. They said they didn't need it. They'd done enough training all their lives. Well, so the problems between doctors and nurses were solved if only the nurses got the training. So we have a little real problem with certain attitudes which we have to handle. It's not so simple. So when you become a doctor and somebody suggests doing some training, remember, don't say no. Don't say you're good enough. You can also do with some help. So there are all kinds of characteristics one looks for, like motivation, attitudes, etc., etc. These are things that will take place when one is trying to select the right crew. We are involved in this because we are also considering selecting the right crew for the next Mars mission. What kind of people are we going to select? And I'll tell you that in the next hour. It's an interesting topic. We still haven't decided exactly how we're going to go about it. But these are the things which we have to consider. What kind of traits? Not necessarily the hero, but maybe the person who has other soft qualities. This is again where the Russians have had a lot of experience, and I've already talked to you about it. One of the examples was when the Russians are sending a team up there, and one member gets sick, the whole team is grounded, which means that they'll fly on a later mission. The other team members don't like it, but that's the way it is, because they consider that one shouldn't break the team up. The Americans work differently. If a person is sick, then he is replaced. It doesn't matter that he comes from another team. And this can cause a certain amount of problems. It's just like you've been training for a certain work that you've been doing together for months, if not years, and then suddenly at the last minute, one member of your team changes. He's an outsider, he's a foreigner, he's different. It can be a big problem, how to deal with it. These are the real problems which one can get also in space work, how to handle it. You're preparing people for a mission from Mars that they've been training for 10 years, and maybe you have to break up a team because one member has become sick, and maybe the others will never go to Mars as a result. It can be a very great problem. How do you deal with it? I don't know. But these are the real problems that one will deal with. On the ground, fortunately, it's a little bit easier. I mentioned Patricia Santi. It's a good book to read if everybody. It's a very heavy book to read. That's why I would recommend more the Dragonfly. But for those who want to be scientific and see some of the background of the psychological problems NASA has had, then Patricia is the right one. We have some simulations we've done in space to recognize and measure all these things, to do some of this research that Munzi was suggesting, and to test some of the methods and to train. These are some of the ground simulations we've done. 30 days underwater in Norway, in a hyperbaric in a chamber underwater. XMMZ, that was done in also a hyperbaric chamber, but it was under normal air pressure for 60 days with 3 males and 1 female. There was another mission of 135 days in Moscow, and a very short mission in Canada, and an interesting one, Sphinx, which was 240 days, and that I'll talk to you a little bit about, because this one was not prepared very well, the Sphinx mission. They wanted to get some Europeans on board. They started the whole thing rather late. None of the space agencies officially collaborated, so they got the volunteers whom they could scratch the bottom of the bucket. So they were not the ideal subjects, which proved to be very interesting because they didn't get along. And it proved to be psychologically nirvana for the psychologists, because we don't want things to be very normal. We want people to have problems in order to analyze them. If they have no problems, there's nothing to analyze. So the psychologist always rubs his hands when he sees problems, because then he can collect data. And that was a very good mission in that sense. The Mars 500, they took care. Because one of the problems of the Sphinx mission, the one female, ended up causing a big fiasco. They made sure they only had males on board. Unfortunate. That's not the way to progress. One should have handled the problem and done a mixed mission again and tried to correct it. But they were too afraid, and they decided to make it only a males-only mission. I think that was unfortunate. Just to show you some pictures, to be entertaining, you've been having too much text up there. This was the XMMZ. They took you will see a hyperbaric chamber as part of it, this one here, and this was a so-called laboratory, and this is a storage area. And that's how they more or less lived. And this one here was the Sphinx mission. It was a long-duration isolation mission. It was supposed to simulate the space station and to simulate conditions there. The configuration of it, this is what it more or less looked like. It had several cubicles. And just for your information, it turned out that the Russians had a cubicle where they all shared one room, the 4 Russians, and the luxurious Europeans had several little rooms where they were allowed to have a separate bed in. So the conditions were not very equal. This is the way it looked like. This is where the Russian crew and then the visiting crew. What do I mean by the visiting? This is the way it looked like. These were the actual, because they were actually hermetically sealed originally. They didn't use it for that purpose, but the purpose was also to analyze how they could survive and how much oxygen was used, how many gases were emanated, came out, came in, etc. So there was a lot of work in this direction being done. For this particular mission, they didn't hermetically seal it. Actually, it was so unsealed that they unofficially were able to import in a lot of alcohol for the Russians, and many of them, by the end of the 11 months in space, were simply glazed eyes and drunk most of the time. So it was not a very well scientifically controlled mission. This is again the way the hall looks like. Huge big hall. So it shows that it's not that simple to create something like this. And essentially, it was carried out in Moscow, and yeah, I already said that. And we had one crew which was 240 days. The next crew visited them for about 110 days. As I said, it was the last crew was very international, as you can see. This was the timeline, more or less. You had the first crew staying the whole time, and then visiting crews coming for shorter periods. So this more or less gives you an example of a complicated simulation mission. And then you had all the psychologists trying to do experiments during this mission. Now the simulation was riddled with interpersonal, intergroup, and intragroup problems. There were a lot of problems and a lot of issues, partly because they were not selected to be compatible, which was good, because then we were able to analyze such problems. There were a lot of issues, and some of the main problems were between the Russian crew and the international crew, the more totally diverse from culture, which is again what one would expect. Each team, we noticed, just the results to tell you, had a member who was an isolate. There were language issues. There was a female member who was a little bit uncertain of herself and sexually, and therefore she kind of ended up being provocative with the crew to a great extent. And then when the crew reacted, then she was very annoyed and offended, which is often the case. I hate to put it so negatively, but there was a cross-cultural thing. On New Year's Eve, Russians all kiss each other. Well, if you have only one woman there, she's the only one to get kissed. They kiss each other too, the males. Not so intimately. Anyway, it turned out that this one woman did not want to get kissed, and she was very annoyed. The main problem afterwards was not that. The problem was the ground control didn't know how to deal with the problem. She complained, and they didn't know what to do. Russians thought, here is a North American, the woman was North American, and she wrote an email to them telling them that she was almost threatening legal action, which is a problem. If the Russians tried to persuade the crew member to apologize, it means he has admitted that he has done something wrong, which means he could have some legal action against him. If he didn't apologize, then it would be psychologically bad. Now, they decided to go into consultation. Well, that was the 1st of January. Everybody was away, and those who were not away were drunk in Russia. So they had to wait a few days until they could get all their psychologists sober and their lawyers back from their vacation in order to consult and decide what to do. So until they reacted very soberly and very measuredly, it took about 5 days, which the crew were extremely annoyed, and the poor young girl felt she was totally neglected, which she was. So these were the kind of things that happened, which they didn't know how to deal with, unfortunately. So the situation blew up. We as scientists were told we shouldn't be communicating with the crew directly, although we had email, because the official psychologists should deal with such problems. So we didn't react either because we felt we shouldn't. So they felt neglected by us too. Very bad problems. So anyway, the next mission, Mars 500, they made sure there were 6 men on board, and they all got along wonderfully, and I think psychologically it was not so interesting. The first mission was much more interesting. But just to let you know, they did certain survival training, they did a certain amount of Mars simulation up there, and essentially this was to try to prepare a mission for Mars, but had almost no problems. We do have, I think I don't really have time, but I'll just briefly show you that there is a presentation on the Concordia station where some psychology and medical experiments are being done. This presentation is also up there, and it shows you some forms of medical experiments that are being done up there and some psychological experiments. You can look at this presentation, and if you're interested, you can look in the internet